We gonna take it, 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 gonna take it to the top. I'm gonna take it to the top. I'm gonna call my name, yes, come and say my name. Call my name, I'm never gonna stop. If you just call my name, I'm never gonna drop it.
Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the intro. So I've just been away snowboarding and skiing in Austria, and I wanted to make a quick video about the Insta360 1R and whether it's any good for snow sports and how it compares to the competition. So the main benefit of the 1R is that you not only get a 360 camera module, you also get a 4K camera module as well, which is similar to the GoPro Hero 8. And I mainly shot in 360 mode because I think this gives a better perspective for both skiing and snowboarding. I've made a separate video on how to mount your camera and get the best results, so I will link that in the description below and somewhere up here, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. Now, a lot of people have said in reviews of the 1R that the video quality hasn't really improved much from the 1X. I actually think for video the 1R is slightly higher quality. Appreciate that the sensor and everything is pretty much the same, but I think because they're using a slightly different codec, H.265, and also that they are allowing you to export the file straight from the camera rather than having to put it onto your phone first. You can actually edit using the connection to the camera and then export it straight from there onto your phone, rather than having that extra export step of exporting it from the camera to the phone and then doing an export out of the app onto your phone album. So I've been doing all of my editing so far in the phone app on the iPhone 11 Pro. And one thing I would say is that when you're connected to the camera, it does heat up both the camera and the iPhone. So that's something to be aware of. I think it's because you're running it with Bluetooth and with Wi-Fi. So in terms of video image quality, I'm going to play you a couple of clips now. This first one is the Insta360 1R, and I think it's really crisp, it's really clear. The quality slightly breaks down on the stitch line, and we'll talk about that later a bit more. It also slightly breaks down when you zoom in using the phone app. So obviously you can manipulate the footage, but as you can see when I zoomed in, it doesn't look quite as good. Similarly, the 1X has the same issues, but I think it just has a little bit worse quality overall. Just looks a little bit of a softer image to me, and in my opinion I don't think it's quite as good as the 1R. So I think overall the image quality of the 1R is better. In terms of competition, the GoPro Max I've not used for skiing or snowboarding, but I have used it for mountain biking, and I've generally tested it for vlogging as well. There's a link to that test video against the Hero 8 above. I think overall the Max is probably similar in quality to the 1R. I'd say colour wise it's probably a little bit better, but it does seem to crush the blacks a lot, and I find it harder to edit that footage than the 1R footage. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was audio, and again the 1R has improved on the 1X in my opinion. I know that Insta360 brought out the firmware update for the 1X recently that added true audio, but in my testing I found that that didn't really have a huge impact on the footage, particularly for action sports when you want to pick up ambient noise such as skiing and snowboarding, and then you actually want voices as well. So I'm going to play you a couple of clips here which show the difference between the 1R and the 1X. See what you think.
That's my ideal. You can get a bit of speed up, you can cut some turns. It's literally my ideal, I love it. I've had such a good time this morning.
Did you say that we were going? Did you tell them we were going? What? Okay. Cool. So we go, oh, just follow me. We go straight and then we go left. Now obviously the 1R sound quality still isn't great. The wind reduction does a half decent job, but it's not brilliant. I do think that the GoPro Max is better all around for audio from the testing I've done so far anyway. Again, I've not used the Max for skiing or snowboarding, but I have used it on a bike at speed on my mountain bike, and the wind noise was dealt with pretty well, and you could hear it doing a better job than the 1X that I was testing up against at the time. And here's a quick clip of that now. Okay, so this is a quick test, dual mounted chest mount, quite a bumpy track. Okay, so moving on to stitching, and this is quite a big one for 360 cameras in general. I found that the 1X stitch line was excellent. When it had the waterproof case on, it wasn't quite so good, but it still did a pretty good job of stitching with the case on. One thing I've noticed on the 1R, particularly with skiing and snowboarding, is that the footage does suffer on the stitch line more than the 1X. So you can see the difference in the width there, and it is, I mean, if you look at that, it is significantly thicker. I'd say it's about half again. So the result of that, as you'll see in these clips, is that the 1X does a great job of the stitch line, even close to the camera. So as you can see in this clip, when I adjust the selfie pole, my glove is right up to the camera, and it's only then that it really starts to break up on the stitch line. And also you'll notice in these clips that the glove I'm holding the 1R in, when I'm holding it out on a long stick snowboarding, you can see that the glove looks a bit odd, and compare that to the 1X where it just looks like the camera's completely floating. You can't tell where I'm holding it really, whereas on the 1R it's quite clear that the stitching just isn't quite as good. Now this is something that I'm sure they will improve with firmware, but I think overall they're not going to be able to do that much because of the depth and width of the camera. So I would say the 1R is comparable to the GoPro Max in this respect. As you'll see from this mountain biking clip, if you look at the handlebars, the stitch line just looks a little bit dodgy. And yeah, overall I've found that you just notice it more in clips. So this clip of my wife skiing past me, as she skis past me and goes through that stitch line, she's probably about 6 to 8 foot away, and it still shows up in the line. You can see it just doesn't look quite right as she goes through it. Okay, so I just wanted to jump into the video to make 2 points. One is that I haven't talked about the red dot in the image quality section, which is an issue that still plagues the footage from the 1R. It's not quite as bad, I don't think, as what you used to get out of the footage on the 1X, but essentially it's a lens flare. It seems to be that Insta360 haven't been able to correct in firmware yet, and it's been a known issue on the 1X since it was released, so I can't see that they'll be able to resolve it in firmware very easily, if at all. So that's something to be aware of. You don't get it on the GoPro Max from the testing I've done, certainly, and I've not seen anyone else mention anything like that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the mount that I was using in Austria the first time I was out there was not this one. This is the Insta360 mount that comes with it, that allows you to mount it onto a pole with that 1/4-20. Now, the one I was using in Austria the first time, which shows up in some of the footage, was this one, which, as you can see, hopefully is wider. It's got that round base, and unfortunately I left this in my car the first time I went away with it snowboarding, so that's why some of the clips you see have that little black bit in kind of on the stitch line a little bit. But yeah, the other point to make is that this camera, the 1R, is just much harder to mount, because it's harder to get straight on the mount and make sure it's exactly lined up, whereas the 1X, you literally just screwed it onto the tripod and you were set. That's partly why my glove looks a bit odd in some of the clips as well. I think the stitching is just not as good, but it is partly because of lining up the camera, and if it isn't perfect, you end up with those issues. Anyway, I just wanted to make those 2 points, and we'll crack on the rest of the video. Moving on, stability and general stabilization of the cameras is really so good now that it's hard to differentiate between them. I found that the 1X always did a good job in good light, and it wasn't so good in low light. Now, if you're skiing and snowboarding, you're generally going to be filming in the sunshine, hopefully, or occasionally if it's snowing or cloudy day, you will be filming in slightly lower light, but it's not going to be dark, and it's not going to be sort of evening usually. But yeah, overall the 1R does a good job of stabilizing the footage. I think it's probably slightly better than the 1X, and I'm sure they will release firmware updates that will probably make it even better. I think the GoPro Max is comparable. I don't think any of these cameras is let down by the stabilization. The one thing I would say is that if you're going through trees, you will notice that sometimes the 1X has a issue with stabilizing when the background is trees. I found that when I was mountain biking with it. I've not noticed that with the 1R yet, albeit I've not tested it so much in that kind of environment. So interesting to see if I find that at all, or whether you found that the 1R does that. But yeah, overall I think the 1R and the GoPro Max are probably pretty comparable on stabilization, so it does a very good job. So next thing I wanted to cover was durability and reliability. Now, I've had quite a few issues in terms of reliability with the 1R while I've been away. I think, to be honest, most of this was due to the fact I hadn't updated the firmware before I went, and I struggled to do it in Austria because I didn't have a great Wi-Fi reception. Now, this camera, because of its design and the way it's modular, I do think suffers more in the cold. So the fact that you've got kind of gaps that the cold can get in. So when it was mounted on the front of my helmet and I was skiing with it, it was like -10, but because of the wind like rushing towards the camera, I do think that it got very cold very quickly, and the camera actually froze a number of occasions. And I don't know whether that would have happened if the firmware had been updated or not. I probably think it would have happened anyway, but I will do more testing now I've updated the firmware. But it is something to be aware of. I think I've never had an issue with the 1X freezing or just turning off like that. The 1R basically, while I was recording, it just froze, and as you'll see, I'll put a quick screen record of my phone up on the screen now. You can see that there are files that show us basically being there in the app, but they essentially you can't access them because they're not complete files. So the camera was essentially just recording and then just freezing, and you couldn't stop that recording. And yeah, basically there was a couple of times where it wouldn't turn off, and it's a bit glitchy, and I think it's probably just because it's fairly new and they're updating the firmware all the time. But I do think that I don't know, I don't remember there being so many issues with the 1X when it came out, but to be fair, I did buy it a bit later on after it had been released for probably about 2 months. So again, durability wise, this camera, the 1R, is more durable. It's waterproof for a start. Now, when I was using the 1X in Austria last year, I actually dropped it in powder, and the whole of the camera got covered in snow and wouldn't turn on for about 10 minutes. Not because of the water, but I think because of the cold actually. And obviously you can put it in the Venture case, which is sold separately. This is about £50 or $50. And you can also get a dive case for it, and it works fine. But this, once you put the Venture case on, it does make it considerably heavier than the 1R. So that's something to be aware of. I think the 1R is overall the more durable camera. You can also, when you've got the 1R in its frame, they are going to make available, I haven't got them yet, the lens covers that go on there. So I've not tested it with that. I don't know what the image quality degradation is like with those lens covers on. Hopefully going to get hold of some soon, but basically because of the coronavirus, everything out of China, including all of Insta360 stuff, seems to be delayed at the moment. So yeah, the one thing I would say is that obviously the big selling point of this is that you can take it apart. It's modular. But what I found was that I didn't really swap the modules round much. And the main reason is that when you're out in the cold, you don't really want to take your gloves off and start fiddling around with this. And again, I just found that the 360 module was better for this kind of sports action.
So I think battery life is quite a difficult question to answer. I'm going to play you a little clip here from my studio test that I did a couple of weeks ago.
And now it has stopped recording and shut down pretty quick. That was 49 minutes of recording time in total. So not bad. Given it's not cold in here though, it's not brilliant, is it?
49 minutes out of this battery, that was with the 360 mod attached. I did another test with the 4K mod and it actually overheated after about 45 minutes. So I would say overall, I think it probably would have done just under an hour. It had about 9 or 10% left, so yeah, I think it probably would have got to maybe just under an hour. The overheating issue, I think, has been fixed by the latest firmware. I haven't retried that battery test, so I will do that at some stage. Talking about cold weather testing, again, your mileage is probably going to vary. I think these batteries, they're not all exactly the same. It all depends in terms of how many times they've been recharged, how many times they've been discharged, whether you keep your batteries in a warm, dry place, you know, how long they've been out in the cold. All those variables come into play, so it's quite a difficult one to answer. There's a couple of tests online. INSTA360 has done a test where he actually had the camera just completely die on him after about, I think it was about 15 minutes, and that was, I think he said he had put it into 100 frames a second. Now, I didn't shoot anything in slow motion while I was out in Austria. I was all just filming in the 5.7K 30 frames a second, and I found this battery lasted about, I'd probably say record time 35 to 40 minutes. It's difficult because I wasn't continuously recording, and also I had the issues which I've talked about in this video where the camera was just becoming unresponsive. So it's quite hard to give an exact figure really, but yeah, I definitely think the battery life on this camera, because of the fact it's got that touch screen, and I think just the design of it and the processing that's going on in it, I don't think the battery life is that good at the moment. They're bringing out the larger battery for it, which has the mount built in. That should potentially double the battery life, but whether it will, we'll have to see. But yeah, overall I'd say it's not brilliant at the moment, and when you compare it to something like the GoPro Max, that is going to record for quite a bit longer, probably close to an hour. Again, it's going to vary depending on how cold it is, where you're keeping the camera when you're not using it. You know, is it close to your body with body heat? Is it in a bag? Is it exposed to the wind and the cold? All those things come into play. So I'd say the 1X that I've had and I've used a lot more, the battery life on that to start with was pretty poor. It only gave about half an hour. The cold weather batteries that they released later on actually improved that quite a bit, and you can get probably 45 to 50 minutes out of a battery. Again, there's variables to that, but I would always carry multiple batteries with these cameras anyway. I do with the GoPro, I do with the 1X, and I will do with this. I've got another one on order. So yeah, that's battery life. Hopefully that's been helpful, but it's quite difficult to give a definitive answer. Okay, so this video is going on a bit, so I'm going to just cover workflow quite quickly and do a separate video on that, going through the app and everything, how to edit, all that stuff. So I'd say workflow is improved over the 1X with the phone app, because the camera allows you to edit straight from the camera without having to download the file onto the phone first. So that sort of cuts out a step. You can then export straight from that file into your phone album. That works really well and speeds up the workflow really well. So the 1R is better than the 1X, and I'd say it's better than the GoPro Max as well. I've actually mainly used the phone app on ISO on my iPhone, and it's just mainly because the desktop app, although it's okay, it's a bit clunky. It's harder to edit fast on it, I find. And also it hasn't got some of the features of the phone app, like the tracking and stuff like that. It's just, yeah, I much prefer the other phone app. For the phone app, it's getting better all the time. I've just updated the firmware and I've seen a couple of improvements.
over the previous version. And yeah, overall I really like the phone app. You can do a lot in it, and it's better than the GoPro equivalent, I would say. It's similar, but there's a bit more advanced features and it's a bit more refined. There's a lot of AI stuff in the app as well now, which wasn't in the One X app, so that's worth looking at. And yeah, I'll go into more detail on that, but overall workflow on this camera is really good. As far as 360 cameras go, it's the best one I've used for workflow and speed of workflow. So yeah, have a look at the video I do on the workflow stuff separately. So guys, sorry it's gone on a bit long. Hopefully that's been helpful for you. I think this camera is an improvement over the One X generally for skiing and snowboarding and winter sports generally. There are some downsides that I've talked about, but yeah, overall it's pretty good. The GoPro Max is an alternative, but I think as a package, because you get that 4K module as well, I think this really is quite a good deal for the money. It's got its drawbacks. The audio is not as good as GoPro. Some of the colours aren't quite as good as GoPro, but it's up to you guys. See what you think. So if you are interested in picking up any of these cameras, check out the links in the description below. They are affiliate links, so I do get a small commission, which really helps my channel grow and basically pays for my time in making these videos. So these type of reviews do take a lot of time, just trying to get all the 360 footage together. So yeah, much appreciated if you do click through on any of those links. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please do like it. That helps the channel massively. Click the bell for notifications. Do subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.